Forgiven by the Alpha, a Werewolf, Shifter Romance written by Shelfie Bennett. Chapter 1. Haunted by the Past. The snap of a branch echoed again, sharper this time. My muscles tensed as I gripped the hilt of my dagger tighter, every instinct screaming at me to melt into the shadows. Staying alive as a rogue meant being invisible, a ghost in the wilderness. But something about the sound raised the hairs on the back of my neck. A low, guttural laugh carried through the cold air, followed by the distinct crunch of boots on frosted leaves. My breath hitched, my heartbeat suddenly deafening in my ears. Not a fox. Definitely not a fox. I shifted silently, inching toward the tree line. My eyes scanned the dark, and that's when I saw them. 3 figures moving like predators, their silhouettes sharp and dangerous against the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. Darius wants it done by the next full moon. One of them growled, his voice a coarse rasp. If Moonfang thinks they're safe behind their territory lines, they've got another thing coming. Moonfang. The name struck me like a blow to the chest. I froze, my fingers tightening on my dagger as their voices carried through the clearing. "And you're sure the pack won't see us coming?" Another one asked, his tone skeptical. "They've got that alpha, what's his name? Caleb?" "He's no pushover." A bark of laughter. "Caleb's beta. Marcus is the real threat," the first one replied, spitting the name like it was poison. "Take him out, and the rest will fall in line." My blood turned cold. Moonfang wasn't my home, but hearing their plans felt personal, like a blade twisting in an already open wound. Caleb and Arya, 2 wolves who had every reason to hate me, had built something strong and unshakable, and now these rogues were planning to tear it apart. I pressed my back against the tree, willing myself to become invisible. "Stay hidden, Evelyn. This isn't your fight." But their next words stopped my breath. "Darius wants the traitor too," the first rogue said, his voice dripping with malice. "Says she knows enough to bring the whole pack to its knees." A chill ran down my spine. The traitor. Me. It took everything I had not to gasp aloud. My grip on the dagger was so tight, my knuckles ached. They were hunting me and using Moonfang as their battlefield. One of them sniffed the air, and my heart lurched. I shrank deeper into the shadows, silently cursing the faint scent trail I hadn't been careful enough to mask. My pulse pounded as I forced myself to stay still, every instinct screaming at me to run. But then their voices faded, the rogues moving deeper into the forest, their laughter and muttered threats swallowed by the trees. I slumped against the tree, every muscle in my body trembling. The cold night air burned in my lungs as I fought to steady my breathing. What now? I could slip away, disappear into the wild like I always had. Stay hidden and let the wolves of Moonfang fight their own battles. They'd never forgive me anyway, not after what I'd done. But something inside me rebelled against the thought. Moonfang didn't deserve this ambush. Caleb didn't. Arya didn't. And Marcus, well, I owed them all, even if they'd never accept it. I looked toward the forest, where the rogues had vanished. My fingers flexed around the dagger, the worn leather of the handle grounding me. I'd spent a year running from my past, convincing myself I didn't care what happened to the packs I'd wronged. Maybe it was time to stop running. The border loomed ahead, an invisible line between rogue wilderness and the ordered chaos of pack territory. The crisp night air carried faint traces of Moonfang wolves, earthy and sharp, with the underlying musk of dominance. It was a scent that should have warned me away. Instead, it tugged at something deep inside me, something I refused to name. The forest floor crackled beneath my boots, each sound a betrayal in the heavy silence. Moonlight filtered through the branches, illuminating patches of mossy ground and bare roots. My breathing was steady, my steps calculated. I'd survived too long as a rogue to make a rookie mistake now. Still, the weight of what I was about to do gnawed at me. Crossing into pack territory was suicide under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances. Just get to the estate, warn them about the attack, and get out, I muttered under my breath. My voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the shadows around me. No attachments. No explanations. Just enough to settle my debt if I even owed one. But as soon as I crossed the invisible line, every hair on my body stood on end. A warning. Too late. The growl came first, low and rumbling, vibrating through the trees like a storm on the horizon. My heart lurched as a dark shape materialized ahead, stepping out of the shadows with deliberate menace. "Stop right there," a deep voice commanded. It wasn't a request. I froze, my hand instinctively gripping the hilt of my dagger. "Not exactly a warm welcome," I shot back, keeping my tone light even as my pulse hammered. The wolf stepped closer, the moonlight catching on his features. Broad shoulders, piercing amber eyes, and a sharp jawline that looked like it could cut glass. His presence was magnetic, a force of nature wrapped in stoic control. Damon. I'd heard whispers about him, the warrior with unwavering loyalty to Caleb. He was exactly the kind of wolf I'd hoped to avoid. "Rogues aren't welcome here," he said, his voice as cold and unyielding as the night air. "Really?" I arched a brow, tilting my head. I thought Moonfang was known for its hospitality. "Turn around," he growled, his gaze narrowing. "This is your only warning." I could have played coy, maybe even flirted my way out of it. But there was a hard edge to Damon, a no-nonsense energy that told me he wouldn't hesitate to follow through on his threat. "I don't have time for this," I snapped, stepping forward. "Big mistake?" In an instant, he was in front of me, his hand gripping my arm with enough force to stop me in my tracks. Heat radiated from him, the scent of pine and leather wrapping around me in an unwelcome embrace. "Make time," he said, his amber eyes boring into mine. For a moment I faltered. There was no mistaking the strength coiled beneath his calm exterior, or the barely restrained anger simmering in his gaze. But I wasn't about to back down. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble," I said, meeting his glare head-on. "I have information about an attack on your pack. Take me to Caleb, or let me go." His grip tightened, his expression unreadable. "And I'm supposed to trust a rogue with no proof?" I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "You don't have to trust me. Just decide if you can afford to ignore me." Damon's jaw ticked, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a frustrated growl, he released me. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "But one wrong move, and I'll make you regret crossing that line." "Noted," I said, brushing past him with more confidence than I felt. As I followed him deeper into Moonfang territory, his presence loomed beside me, a constant reminder that I wasn't welcome here. But I couldn't shake the feeling that his distrust wasn't the only thing simmering beneath the surface. This was going to be interesting. The estate loomed ahead, a sprawling, moonlit fortress nestled in the heart of the Moonfang clan's territory. Its grandeur was almost disarming: wooden beams, sturdy stone, and a commanding presence that matched the wolves who ruled within it. But the beauty of it didn't matter. Not when Damon marched me through the gates like I was some criminal awaiting judgment, which I supposed wasn't entirely inaccurate. The heavy doors creaked open, revealing a grand hall filled with wolves. Their sharp gazes landed on me, suspicion and curiosity mingling in equal measure. Whispers rippled through the air, and I caught snippets: "Rogue, traitor, what is she doing here?" Each word was a dagger, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. I kept my head high, refusing to shrink beneath their stares. "Well, this is cozy," I muttered under my breath. Damon shot me a glare but didn't respond. He led me to the center of the hall, where Caleb stood, exuding the quiet of Audiobook, who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. His piercing eyes locked onto mine, a blend of curiosity and caution flickering in their depths. Beside him was Aria, her presence a reminder of everything I'd lost. She looked as radiant as ever, her sharp wit and strength practically tangible. The sight of her stirred something bitter in my chest: regret, jealousy, shame, maybe all three. "Evelyn Carter." Caleb's voice was calm but carried the weight of an avalanche. "I didn't expect to see you here again." I met his gaze, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Believe me, Alpha, this wasn't on my to-do list either." Arya's expression tightened, and I could feel the judgment radiating from the pack around me. Damon stepped forward, his voice a low rumble. I caught her crossing the southern border. She claims she has information about an attack. Claims? I interjected, feigning offense. That's an awfully big word for someone who hasn't heard me out yet. Caleb's brow arched. Then start talking. I exhaled slowly, trying to ignore the way the room seemed to press in around me. A group of rogues is planning to attack Moonfang territory. I overheard them at one of their camps. They're organized, far more than they should be. And they're coming for you. The room fell silent, the weight of my words settling like a storm cloud. Caleb's sharp gaze remained fixed on me, searching for any hint of deception. Why should we believe you? Arya's voice cut through the tension, her tone laced with steel. I met her eyes, forcing myself not to flinch. You don't have to. But ignoring me could cost you a lot more than a little pride. A murmur of unease spread through the pack, their whispers like the hum of bees in my ears. And why warn us now? Caleb asked, his voice softer but no less commanding. Because I owed them. Because my betrayal had led to this, even if indirectly, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Instead, I shrugged, masking my vulnerability with a smirk. Let's just say I have a vested interest in not seeing this place burn to the ground. Damon shifted beside me, his tension palpable. Caleb exchanged a glance with Arya, their silent conversation speaking volumes. Finally, he nodded. Damon, take her to the holding quarters. We'll decide what to do with her after we verify her claims. Seriously, I blurted, unable to hide my frustration. I come here to help. And this is the thanks I get? You're lucky we're giving you the benefit of the doubt at all, Arya snapped, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't wrong, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. Damon grabbed my arm, his grip firm but not painful, and began leading me out of the hall. As we passed through the crowd, the whispers grew louder, and I caught flashes of their distrust in their faces. This wasn't just a room full of strangers, they were wolves I'd wronged. Wolves who had every reason to hate me. And yet, as I glanced back at Caleb and Arya, their expressions unreadable, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was where I was meant to be, even if it killed me. Chapter 2. The central hall of the Moonfang estate felt heavier than it had last night, though maybe that was just my imagination or the stairs boring into me from every direction. Wolves flanked the room, their gazes sharp with mistrust, and I felt like prey being scrutinized by predators. Caleb sat at the head of the hall, his calm demeanor somehow more unnerving than outright aggression. To his left, Arya sat poised and composed, though her eyes were an unforgiving steel. Marcus stood off to Caleb's right, his stoic presence a silent wall of judgment. And just behind me, Damon loomed like a sentry, his gaze burning into the back of my skull. Start from the beginning, Caleb said, his voice as unyielding as stone. I cleared my throat, ignoring the way my stomach twisted. There's a rogue faction gathering strength near the southern border. I overheard them talking about an attack on Moonfang. They're organized, too organized. They've got plans to strike soon, and they're coming for your territory. The hall was silent, except for the faint crackle of the hearth, but it wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the kind that made my skin itch, like the room itself was waiting for me to slip up. And why should we trust you? Arya's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. I met her gaze head-on, refusing to flinch. You don't have to, but ignoring me won't make this go away. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as he scrutinized me. Why come to us, Evelyn? What's your angle? I hesitated. The truth sat on the tip of my tongue, bitter and jagged. Because I owe you. Because this is the least I can do after what I've done. But saying that aloud felt like admitting to a weakness I wasn't ready to show. I've been running from them, I said instead, keeping my tone even. I'm not about to let them turn me into collateral damage. You're the best chance of stopping them. Marcus's brow furrowed, and he exchanged a glance with Caleb. I could see the unspoken debate in their eyes, the weight of trust and risk teetering on a knife's edge. We don't owe you anything, Arya said coldly. No, you don't, I shot back, unable to keep the bite out of my voice. But you do owe it to yourselves to be prepared. Or do you really think ignoring me is worth risking your pack's safety? That earned a ripple of murmurs from the surrounding wolves. Damon shifted behind me, his tension radiating like heat, but he didn't speak. Caleb finally raised a hand, silencing the whispers. Enough, he stood, his presence commanding the room. You'll stay here, under supervision, until we can verify your claims. But understand this one step out of line and you're out. Permanently. The air in the room felt like it was pressing down on me, but I nodded. Fair enough, Damon, Caleb said, his voice carrying the weight of an order. You'll keep watch over her. What? Damon's voice was sharp, his surprise evident. You heard me, Caleb said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She stays under your supervision. Marcus, standing by Caleb's side, folded his arms, a ghost of a smirk tugging at his lips. Second chances, Damon. They've been known to work out. His words were pointed, and I caught the subtle reference to Lyra, Marcus's mate, from what I'd heard. Damon didn't look amused. His jaw tightened and his hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't argue further. Fine, he said, his voice clipped. But if she so much as breathes wrong, I'm hauling her out myself. I rolled my eyes, crossing my arms, looking forward to the stellar hospitality already. Caleb shot me a warning glance. Don't test me, Evelyn. The room was still as Caleb dismissed the meeting. Wolves began to disperse, but their distrust lingered like a shadow, and Damon's gaze burned into me, as if he were already regretting his new assignment. As the hall emptied, Arya approached me, her expression unreadable. Don't mistake this for forgiveness, she said quietly, her voice low enough that only I could hear. You're walking on thin ice. Don't give us a reason to break it. I met her gaze, forcing myself to stay composed. Noted. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in a sea of wolves who wanted nothing to do with me. Almost alone. You're coming with me, Damon said gruffly, stepping into my line of sight. His tone was all business, but his eyes, those stormy gray eyes, flashed with a frustration that almost made me grin. Lead the way, babysitter, I said, flashing him a cheeky smile. His jaw clenched, but he didn't respond, turning on his heel and stalking toward the door. I followed, the weight of the pack's judgment still heavy on my shoulders. But somewhere beneath it, a spark of defiance burned. If they thought I was going to roll over and make this easy for them, they had another thing coming. Damon's quarters were exactly as I'd imagined, clean, cold and utterly devoid of personality. The bed was neatly made, the furniture minimal and functional, and not a single item out of place. It was like he'd built a shrine to his own control issues. I crossed the threshold, my boots scuffing against the polished wood floor, and couldn't help the smirk tugging at my lips. Let me guess, you alphabetize your shirts too? Damon shot me a look that could have frozen fire. Stay out of my way, Carter. And out of my things. Noted, I said breezily, throwing my bag, what little I had, onto the couch in the corner. The fabric was stiff and scratchy, and it screamed, don't get comfortable. You're not staying there, he said, his voice sharp. I quirked a brow, leaning against the armrest. Oh? Planning to offer me the bed? His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought I'd actually made the stoic warrior crack. You're staying on the cot in the storage room. I glanced at the door. He gestured toward a small, dark room that I doubted even had a window. Cozy, I said, rolling my eyes. You sure know how to make a girl feel welcome. This isn't about making you feel welcome, he snapped, folding his arms. His broad shoulders seemed even broader in the confined space of the room, and his presence filled it in a way that was both irritating and distractingly magnetic. You're here because Caleb ordered it. Don't make me regret following through. I pushed off the couch and stepped closer, invading his personal space just enough to see the flicker of annoyance and something else in his stormy gray eyes. Trust me, Damon, this arrangement isn't exactly my dream vacation either. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment the tension crackled between us, sharp and electric. "Then stay out of trouble," he said finally, his voice dropping to a low rumble that sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. I forced a smirk, leaning back with exaggerated ease. "Trouble's not really my thing. I'm more of a misunderstood, wrongfully accused type. That's one way to put it." The dig was sharp, but I refused to let it sting. Instead, I let my smirk widen, tilting my head. "Careful, Damon. If I didn't know better, I'd think you actually cared about what kind of person I am." He stepped closer, his height and intensity making the small space feel even smaller. "Don't mistake my caution for care," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're here because Caleb thinks you might be useful. That's it. Whatever helps you sleep at night," I shot back, refusing to break eye contact. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Then he stepped back, shaking his head. "Get settled," he muttered, turning toward the door. "Where are you going?" I asked, unable to stop the question from slipping out. "To get some air," he said without looking back. The door shut behind him with a sharp click, leaving me alone in his perfectly ordered, frustratingly rigid space. I flopped onto the couch, exhaling a long breath. Damon might have been insufferable, but there was something about him, something raw and guarded, that made me want to crack his armor, if only to see what was underneath. And if I had to stay here, I might as well entertain myself by trying. The silence in Damon's quarters wasn't peaceful. It was stifling, heavy with unsaid words and the stubborn energy of a man who clearly thought I was better off in chains or anywhere else that didn't involve him babysitting me. I leaned against the counter in the small kitchenette, watching as he stalked back in after his brief escape outside. The moonlight clung to him like a second skin, catching on the sharp line of his jaw and the rigid set of his shoulders. He closed the door with a soft thud, his movements precise and controlled, as if he'd trained himself to never make a mistake. "How's the air out there?" I asked, breaking the tension. "Still cold? Judgy? Like you?" His glare was immediate, and so sharp it could have sliced steel. "You're pushing it, Carter." "Am I?" I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "I thought we were bonding. Isn't this what you do with all your unwilling houseguests?" "I don't have houseguests," he shot back, his tone clipped. "And if I did, they wouldn't be rogues with a track record of betrayal." "Ah, there it is," I said, folding my arms and giving him my best smirk. The subtle reminder of my mistakes. "You know, you could save time and just tattoo traitor on my forehead. It'd really drive the point home." His jaw ticked, and he crossed the room in a few long strides, stopping just short of invading my space. "You don't get to play the victim here," he said, his voice low and laced with restrained frustration. "You lied, you manipulated, you put an entire pack at risk. Forgive me if I'm not thrilled about having you under the same roof." I met his glare head-on, refusing to let him see the sting his words carried. "And yet here you are, stuck with me. You must have drawn the short straw, huh?" He exhaled sharply, his frustration palpable. "This isn't a game, Evelyn. People are risking their lives to protect what you so easily threw away. So spare me the sarcasm." "Risking their lives," I repeated, arching a brow. "What do you think I've been doing out there, Damon? Knitting sweaters and roasting marshmallows? Just because I'm not waving your precious Moonfang banner doesn't mean I haven't been fighting to survive. Or does that not count unless the first have your seal of approval?" His eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his expression. "You're good at this, aren't you?" "Good at what?" "Deflecting," he said, his voice softer now but no less cutting. "Twisting the conversation so you don't have to answer for anything real. It's like second nature to you." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit, and for a moment, I let the silence settle between us. But I wasn't about to let him have the last word. "Maybe I do deflect," I said finally, my tone softer but laced with challenge. "But maybe you're not as hard to read as you think. Let me guess, strong, silent type with a code of honor so rigid it's practically suffocating. Always does the right thing, even when it kills you inside." I stepped closer, watching as his expression shifted ever so slightly. Sound about right? Damon's eyes darkened, and his lips pressed into a tight line. Careful, Carter, he said, his voice a low warning. You don't know me. Maybe not, I admitted, shrugging. But I know enough to see that this whole brooding, self-sacrificing act isn't just for me. You've been carrying something long before I showed up. Maybe you should take your own advice and stop deflecting. His breath hitched, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make me feel like I'd struck a nerve. For a moment I thought he might snap back with something cutting. But instead he just shook his head and turned away. Get some sleep, he muttered, his voice quieter now. You'll need it. I watched as he moved to the far side of the room, his back to me, every line of his body taut and controlled. Sweet dreams, Damon, I said with a smirk, knowing full well I'd gotten under his skin. He didn't answer, but I could have sworn I saw his shoulders tense just a little more. Good. Let him stew. Chapter 3. The Moonfang training grounds were a hive of activity, wolves in both forms darting through drills, their movements sharp and purposeful. The air was thick with the sense of sweat, earth, and unspoken judgment, a cocktail I'd grown far too familiar with. I stood at the edge of the clearing, watching Caleb and Marcus pore over a map spread across a makeshift table. Their focus was intense, their voices low but commanding as they discussed rogue activity along the southern border. Evelyn, Caleb called, his tone neutral yet weighted. You said the rogues are using guerrilla tactics. How exactly are they operating? All eyes turned to me. The weight of their stares, heavy with mistrust, settled like a stone in my chest. Still, I straightened my spine and stepped forward, determined not to let it show. They're opportunistic, I began, pointing to a cluster of marks on the map that represented recent attacks. They'll target patrols in the densest parts of the forest areas where visibility is low and reinforcements take longer to reach. It's not random, they're testing your response times, looking for weak points. Marcus nodded, his sharp gaze flicking between the map and me. And how do we stop them? You change the pattern, I said simply, glancing at Caleb. Make them think you're predictable, then hit them where they don't expect it. Double the patrols in the northern areas, they'll assume you're thinning your numbers elsewhere. Caleb's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. You've thought this through. I had to, I replied, keeping my tone steady. When you're a rogue, staying one step ahead of the packs is the only way to survive. The truth hung in the air like a blade, cutting both ways. I wasn't trying to justify my past, but there was no escaping it either. From the corner of my eye, I caught Damon standing just beyond the group, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. His presence was like a shadow, silent, watchful, and impossible to ignore. You're assuming we trust you enough to take your advice, he said, his voice low but laced with skepticism. I turned to face him fully, tilting my head. I'm not asking for trust, Damon. I'm offering you information. What you do with it is your choice. His dark eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, I thought he might fire back with something scathing. Instead, he just nodded, the smallest inclination of his head that felt more begrudging than anything else. Later, as the strategy session wrapped up and the wolves dispersed, I lingered near the edge of the training grounds, watching Damon. He was sparring with one of the younger wolves, his movements precise and fluid. Every strike and counterstrike calculated. There was no denying his skill or the intensity that came with it. He fought like a man with something to prove, though I wasn't sure if he was trying to convince himself or everyone else. When the sparring session ended, Damon grabbed a towel and wiped the sweat from his brow before his gaze landed on me. You're still here, he said, his tone more observation than question. Should I be flattered you noticed? I quipped, crossing my arms. He sighed, shaking his head as he walked closer. You're making things harder for yourself, you know. By existing? By not knowing when to stop, he countered, his eyes locking with mine. You've got Caleb and Marcus willing to hear you out. But that doesn't mean the rest of us are convinced. Pushing boundaries won't help. I raised a brow. And what would you suggest, oh wise and all-knowing Damon? Should I just keep my head down and hope everyone forgets I exist? Something like that. he said, though there was a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips now. At least until you've actually proven you're not playing us. I stepped closer, my gaze unwavering. And what will it take to convince you, Damon? Because it feels like I could lay down my life for this pack, and you'd still be looking for an angle. His expression faltered for a fraction of a second, a crack in the armor that told me I'd hit a nerve. Trust isn't given, Evelyn, he said quietly. It's earned. And with your track record, you're starting from less than 0. His words stung, but I refused to let him see it. Instead, I gave him a wry smile. Good thing I'm good at up-hells then, I said lightly, brushing past him as I turned to leave. Behind me, I could feel his gaze lingering, heavy with unspoken thoughts. And though I didn't dare turn around, I couldn't shake the feeling that, for all his doubt, something had shifted. The moon hung heavy and full in the sky, its silvery glow bathing the clearing in a soft, ethereal light. I leaned against an old oak tree, its bark cool and rough beneath my fingertips, and watched the distant figures of the Moonfang wolves moving about the estate. Laughter floated through the night air, muffled but warm, and it made my chest ache with a longing I couldn't quite name. I was a shadow on the edge of their world, close enough to see but never truly part of it. That had been the story of my life, hadn't it? Always just outside the circle, always watching from the periphery. The snap of a twig behind me made my ears twitch, and I spun around, my senses sharpening instinctively. Relax, came Damon's familiar voice, low and steady. If I wanted to hurt you, you wouldn't have heard me coming. I rolled my eyes, leaning back against the tree, and here I thought you were following me out of concern. Silly me. Damon stepped into the clearing, the moonlight catching in his dark eyes and highlighting the sharp lines of his face. He was a study in contrast, stoic and unyielding most of the time, yet something about the way he moved tonight felt softer. What are you doing out here? He asked, crossing his arms as he stopped a few feet away. Observing, I said simply, gesturing toward the estate. You can learn a lot about a pack by how they act when they think no one's watching. He frowned, his gaze flicking between me and the distant wolves. And what have you learned? That they care about each other? I said, unable to keep the hint of wistfulness out of my voice. It's not just duty or instinct. There's warmth there, connection. His frown deepened, but he didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved closer, his boots crunching softly against the grass. You say that like it's a foreign concept, he said finally, his tone probing. I shrugged, forcing a lightness I didn't feel. It's not foreign, just distant. Some of us don't get to have that, you know? Damon's expression softened just barely. You think that's because of what you did? I looked away, focusing on the tree line instead of his face. What I did didn't help, but I was never exactly pack material to begin with. Too stubborn, too ambitious to me. There was a pause, and I expected him to make some cutting remark, to agree that I was difficult or untrustworthy. But instead he surprised me. Maybe you just didn't have the right pack, he said, his voice quieter now. I glanced at him, caught off guard by the hint of understanding in his tone. His gaze was steady, unreadable but not unkind, and for the first time since I'd met him, I felt the tiniest flicker of something unexpected hope. Don't tell me you're going soft on me, Damon, I teased, though my voice lacked its usual bite. He snorted, shaking his head. Don't get used to it. You're still on thin ice? Good, I said with a smirk. I'd hate for this to get boring. He rolled his eyes, but I didn't miss the way his lips twitched, as though fighting back a smile. For a moment we just stood there, the silence between us no longer tense but companionable. It was strange, this truce we'd found in the moonlight, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. But as Damon turned to head back toward the estate, a part of me couldn't help but wish the moment had lasted just a little longer, and that terrified me more than anything. Damon hadn't said a word since we settled near the edge of the clearing. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, not entirely, but it was heavy laden with things left unsaid. I sat cross-legged on the cool grass, the moonlight painting everything in silvery hues. Damon leaned against a tree, his arms crossed over his chest, his watchful eyes fixed on the distant estate. "Do you ever stop brooding?" I teased, trying to cut through the quiet. His lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile, but he didn't take the bait. "Do you ever stop deflecting?" He countered smoothly, his gaze finally shifting to meet mine. I huffed out a soft laugh. "Touche!" We lapsed into silence again, but this time it felt less weighted. I traced a finger through the blades of grass beside me, gathering my thoughts. I didn't owe Damon anything, especially not my regrets, but there was something about the way he was looking at me tonight. It wasn't disdain or suspicion. It was something softer. "I wasn't always like this," I said quietly, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "Like what?" he asked, his tone cautious. "Angry, cynical, lost." I swallowed hard, surprised by how easily the words came out. There was a time when I believed in things like loyalty and honor, when I thought being part of a pack meant something. "What changed?" His question was gentle, but I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest. I did. My laugh was bitter, and I shook my head. Or maybe the pack did. I'm not even sure anymore. Somewhere along the way, ambition took over. I wanted to be seen, to be respected, and I thought I could earn that by being someone else, someone stronger, smarter, more ruthless. Damon's expression softened, his usual sternness giving way to something I couldn't quite place. "And that's why you betrayed them." I flinched at the word, but I didn't deny it. "It's not an excuse. I know that. But yeah, I let my ambition blind me. I made a choice one I can't take back. And now I get to live with the consequences." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze searching mine. "You think you're the only one who's made mistakes?" I blinked, caught off guard by the shift in his tone. "I've made choices I'm not proud of," he admitted, his voice low. "I've let my loyalty to the pack dictate everything who I am, what I want, what I'm willing to sacrifice. Sometimes I wonder if I've given so much to the pack that there's nothing left for me." The vulnerability in his words was like a punch to the gut. I'd seen Damon as this unshakable pillar of duty and discipline, but now, for the first time, I realized there was a person beneath all that armor, someone who doubted, who hurt, who struggled just like me. "It's different for you," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "You're loyal. You've earned their trust. You belong. Do I?" His question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Or am I just a tool they use because I'm good at following orders? The raw honesty in his voice startled me, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I'd spent so long thinking of Damon as this rigid enforcer of the pack's rules, someone who would never understand the choices I'd made, but now I wasn't so sure. I think I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I think we're both better than we give ourselves credit for. You're not just a tool, Damon. You're not some mindless follower, and I'm not the villain of this story, no matter how much it feels that way sometimes." He studied me, his dark eyes unreadable in the moonlight. "You believe that?" I met his gaze, the weight of the moment settling between us. "I want to." The corners of his mouth twitched, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't expected: hope. "Maybe we both need to stop running from who we are," he said finally, his voice barely more than a murmur. I wasn't sure if he was talking about me or himself, but it didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't entirely alone. Chapter 4. The air was crisp with the promise of dawn, but the forest held an unsettling stillness. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence, heavy and ominous. It set my teeth on edge, and I tightened my grip on the dagger strapped to my thigh. "Something's not right," I muttered, my gaze darting through the shadows ahead. Damon, leading the patrol beside me, shot me a wary glance. "I told you, stay back and follow orders." "Relax, Alpha's shadow," I said with a smirk, even though my heart pounded against my ribs. "I'm just here to save your ass when things inevitably go sideways." He didn't rise to the bait, but his jaw tightened. "If you're done talking, maybe try listening for once." I would have thrown another jab his way, but the prickle on the back of my neck stole the words from my lips. It was a sensation I'd come to recognize a predator watching from the dark. "Stop," I said, my voice sharper now. "We're being hunted." The other patrol members stiffened, their eyes scanning the trees. Damon's gaze snapped to mine, his expression unreadable. "Where?" he asked, his tone all business. I closed my eyes, letting instinct guide me. The faintest scent of blood and musk drifted on the breeze, coming from the east. My stomach churned. "There," I whispered, pointing toward the shadowed thicket. Damon signaled for the group to form a defensive circle. The tension was palpable as the patrol adjusted their stances, weapons ready. The attack came swiftly. Rogues poured from the trees, snarling and snapping, their eyes gleaming with a feral hunger. Chaos erupted as we clashed, claws and steel meeting in a deadly dance. I ducked a swipe aimed at my throat, plunging my dagger into the rogue's side. He let out a guttural howl, but I didn't stop to celebrate. Another was on me in an instant, his teeth bared. "Evelyn, move," Damon barked. I twisted away just in time, the rogue's claws raking air where my face had been. Damon's sword flashed, cutting the attacker down in one clean motion. "Next time, don't wait for an invitation," I snapped, panting. Damon shot me a glare. "Next time, stay behind me." Before I could retort, a shrill cry pierced the air. One of the younger patrol members had been knocked to the ground, a rogue looming over him. I didn't think I moved. Sliding beneath a low branch, I reached the rogue in 2 heartbeats. With a precise strike, I buried my dagger into its neck. The rogue slumped, and the young wolf scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with terror. "Get back to the circle," I ordered. He hesitated but nodded, stumbling toward the others. When I turned, Damon was staring at me, his expression torn between anger and something else I couldn't name. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" he growled. "Just doing my part," I shot back, wiping blood from my blade. The fight dragged on, but the rogues finally retreated, melting into the shadows like smoke. Their attack had been brutal, but it lacked precision. It wasn't an invasion, it was a warning. The pack regrouped, bruised and bloodied but alive. I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath. Damon approached, his gaze heavy. "You saved them," he said, his voice low. I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "You sound surprised." His eyes softened just a fraction. "I didn't expect you to risk yourself for the pack. Not after." He didn't finish, but I knew what he meant. Not after everything I'd done. I met his gaze, forcing myself to hold it. "I told you, Damon. I'm not the same person I was back then." For a moment it felt like he believed me. Damon's quarters smelled like pine, and something distinctly him earthy, rich, and infuriatingly comforting. I sat perched on the edge of his worn leather couch, my arm cradled against my chest, as blood seeped sluggishly from the gash on my forearm. The adrenaline from the fight had faded, leaving behind an ache that spread from my arm straight to my pride. "You could have waited for me," Damon muttered, his voice a low rumble as he rummaged through a wooden cabinet. "I didn't realize I needed your permission to save lives," I shot back, though the bite in my tone lacked its usual venom. He turned, a small tin of salve in one hand and clean bandages in the other. His piercing eyes locked onto mine, narrowing slightly. "You're reckless." I smirked, leaning back slightly. "You're welcome, by the way. Or is gratitude too much to expect from Moonfang's resident stoic?" Damon's lips twitched, the barest hint of amusement ghosting across his face, before he schooled his expression into something more severe. "You can't keep throwing yourself into danger like that. I didn't see you complaining when I saved your patrol," I retorted, lifting my chin defiantly. He sighed, stepping closer until his broad frame loomed over me. "Hold still." I opened my mouth to argue but snapped it shut when his hand gently grasped my injured arm. His touch was surprisingly careful, the warmth of his fingers a stark contrast to the cold sting of the salve he dabbed onto my wound. "Damon," I started, but the words faltered as his thumb brushed against my skin, sending a jolt of something electric through me. Yes, he asked, his voice softer now. I swallowed hard, searching for something clever or cutting to say, but all I could manage was "that stuff burns." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It's supposed to. The silence between us stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. For once, the usual tension between us felt different, less barbed, more fragile, like something precious we were both too stubborn to acknowledge. "You didn't have to save that patrol," Damon said quietly, his gaze fixed on my arm as he wrapped it with deft precision. I arched a brow. What kind of rogue would I be if I didn't save the day? His hands stilled, and he looked up, his eyes searching mine. "You know what I mean." The air between us crackled, charged with unspoken words and something I wasn't ready to name. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the way it softened like he was seeing me for the first time. "I'm not the monster you think I am, Damon," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, the movement almost imperceptible. "I'm starting to see that." For a fleeting moment, the world outside his cabin ceased to exist. It was just us two people scarred by the past, fumbling towards something that felt dangerously close to hope. "You're good at this," I said, breaking the tension with a teasing smile. "You could have been a healer." Damon chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I think I'll stick to fighting." "Well, in that case, try not to get yourself killed." "I'd hate to have to save you again." He stepped back, his lips curving into a rare smile. "I'll keep that in mind, Evelyn." And for the first time in a long while, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever, a flicker of trust, fragile but undeniable. Damon's hand brushed against mine as he adjusted the bandage on my arm, and it was like a spark of lightning shot through my veins. A simple, fleeting touch, innocent by all accounts, but the heat that ignited in my chest was anything but. I tried to play it cool, but a smirk tugged at my lips. "Careful, Damon. If I didn't know any better, I'd think you were trying to hold my hand." His eyes flicked up to meet mine, and the corner of his mouth twitched. "Trust me, Evelyn. If I wanted to hold your hand, you'd know it." "Oh, really?" I raised an eyebrow, leaning just a little closer. "And what exactly would that look like?" "Sweeping me off my feet with your wolfish charm." Damon huffed a laugh, the sound low and rich. "You're giving yourself far too much credit." But there was something in his tone, something warm and teasing, that made my stomach flip. He straightened, his fingers lingering just a second too long on my wrist before pulling away. I noticed it, I know he did too. The air between us was suddenly charged, humming with an energy I couldn't ignore. "You're blushing," I said, tilting my head to the side and grinning. "I'm not blushing," Damon retorted, though his ears had turned a suspicious shade of red. "Sure you're not," I teased, scooting back on the couch just enough to stretch my legs out casually. "Maybe it's just the cabin. Too hot for you." Damon rolled his eyes and leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "It's definitely not you, if that's what you're fishing for." "Fishing? Oh, Damon," I said, mock offended. "You wound me, I don't fish. I catch." That earned me a real laugh, one that rumbled from deep in his chest. The sound was so unexpected and warm that it softened something inside me, even as I tried to keep my cool. "Well," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "you haven't caught me yet." That shouldn't have made my heart skip, but it did. "Yet," I repeated, drawing out the word with a playful grin. "That's an interesting choice of words." He pushed off the wall and took a step closer, towering over me with that infuriatingly calm demeanor of his. "Careful, Evelyn. I might think you're trying to flirt with me." "Trying?" I scoffed, sitting up straighter. "Damon, I don't try. I succeed." His hand reached down, grazing mine again, this time deliberate, testing. My breath caught in my throat as his thumb brushed against my knuckles, a small, maddening touch that sent heat spiraling through me. "You talk a lot of game," he murmured, his voice so low it felt like a physical caress. "Back it up, then," I challenged, my pulse pounding. For a heartbeat, I thought he might. His gaze flicked to my lips, his hand tightening ever so slightly around mine. The tension between us crackled like a live wire, and I was almost daring him to lean in when, well, he said, stepping back abruptly with a smirk that screamed self-control, maybe you'll catch me someday. The abrupt distance left me reeling, a mix of heat and frustration bubbling to the surface. Coward, I muttered, crossing my arms. Strategist, Damon countered, his grin positively infuriating. And if you're as good as you say, I'm sure you'll figure out how to win. I glared at him, though I couldn't fight the laughter bubbling up. One of these days, Damon, you're going to regret leaving me the upper hand. Maybe, he said, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful, but it'll be worth it. He turned to leave, and I let him go, my skin still buzzing where he'd touched me. Damon might have been playing it cool, but I'd felt that spark. The game was far from over, and I wasn't planning to lose. Chapter 5. The rogue stronghold loomed ahead, a sprawling, half-ruined estate swallowed by the forest. Its shadowy edges blurred into the trees, as if nature itself wanted to bury the place. My chest tightened, a mix of dread and determination pressing down on me. It wasn't just a building, it was a tomb for every bad choice I'd ever made. Are you sure about this? Caleb's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. I squared my shoulders, meeting his gaze. I'm the only one who can do this. They know me. I know them. It's our best shot. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Marcus stood to the side, arms crossed, nodding once in reluctant agreement. I could feel Damon's eyes on me, a constant burn at the back of my neck. I'm going alone, I added, before anyone could object. Not happening, Damon cut in, his tone sharp enough to slice through steel. I turned to him, my patience already frayed. This isn't up for debate. He stepped closer, his imposing frame blocking out the light like a storm cloud. You're walking into a den of wolves who would gladly rip you apart. And you think I'm just going to let you waltz in there alone? I let out a humorless laugh. Let me. Since when do I need your permission? Damon's jaw tightened, his dark eyes narrowing. It's not about permission, Evelyn. It's about survival. You're not doing this without backup. Backup will get me caught, I snapped. They're paranoid enough as it is. One wrong move, one unfamiliar face, and I'm dead. No offense, Damon, but you don't exactly blend in. Neither do you, he shot back. You think they trust traitors any more than strangers? At least if I'm there, you've got someone watching your back. His words hit harder than I wanted to admit. He wasn't wrong, the rogues didn't trust easily. But neither did I, and the thought of Damon in that den of vipers made my stomach twist. Why do you even care? I demanded, folding my arms. You've made it pretty clear you think I'm nothing but trouble. For a moment he didn't answer. His gaze softened, just enough to send a pang through my chest. You're not nothing, Evelyn, he said quietly. The words hung between us, more intimate than any touch. I looked away, the heat rising in my cheeks unwelcome and inconvenient. Fine, I muttered, but if you get me killed, I'm haunting you. A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. Deal. The journey to the stronghold was uneventful, but the silence between Damon and me was anything but comfortable. The tension simmered like a pot about to boil over, unspoken words pressing against the confines of my chest. You've been awfully quiet, I said, breaking the silence as we approached the outer perimeter of the rogue's territory. Focused, he replied curtly. I rolled my eyes. Sure, focused on finding new ways to make me feel like an idiot. Damon's lip twitched. If you're feeling like an idiot, that's not my fault. Wow, I said, shaking my head. Charming as ever. Someone has to keep you humble. Someone has to keep you from brooding yourself into an early grave, I shot back. Ever tried lightening up, cracking a joke, smiling? I smile. Oh, really? When? Damon glanced at me, his gaze steady. When you're not talking. I couldn't help it, I laughed. A real, genuine laugh that startled both of us. Damon's lips quirked, the closest thing to a smile I'd seen from him yet. See, was that so hard? I teased. His expression softened, and for a moment, the tension between us shifted into something warmer, quieter. Evelyn, he said. His voice low, I don't want you to do this alone. I swallowed hard, the sincerity in his tone catching me off guard. "I don't need saving, Damon." "I know," he said, "but that doesn't mean you don't deserve it." I looked away, the weight of his words settling into my chest. He wasn't just talking about this mission. The air in the rogue stronghold was thick, a cocktail of sweat, damp earth, and tension so sharp I could practically taste it. Shadows clung to the crumbling walls, and the dim light of flickering torches barely illuminated the faces of the wolves around me. I forced myself to stand tall, ignoring the stares, the barely concealed sneers of those who knew my name. Evelyn Carter, the traitor. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been a traitor once, but to them I was worse. A deserter. A pair of icy eyes caught mine from across the room, and I stiffened. Larkin, once a trusted ally, now a ghost from a past I wanted to forget. His lean frame was perched casually against the wall, but there was nothing casual about the way his gaze pinned me in place. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice like gravel. "If it isn't the prodigal daughter." I plastered on a smirk I didn't feel. Larkin, still skulking in the shadows, I see. His lips curled into something that might have been a smile if it weren't so sharp. "And you're still running, I hear. Funny how some things never change." The room seemed to shrink around us as I crossed the distance between us. Damon was somewhere nearby, keeping his word to stay out of sight unless things went sideways, but I could feel his presence, like a protective shadow. "I'm not here to exchange insults," I said, keeping my tone even. "I need information, and you're going to give it to me?" Larkin tilted his head, feigning surprise. "Oh. And why would I do that?" "Because if you don't, you'll regret it," I replied, stepping closer. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my expression cool. Larkin let out a low chuckle, his amusement tinged with something darker. Still as fiery as ever. "Fine. I'll bite. What's so important that you'd risk showing your face here?" I leaned in, lowering my voice. "I know Darius is planning something big, and it involves Moonfang. I want to know when and how." For a moment, Larkin's mask slipped, the humor in his eyes replaced by something sharper. "Moonfang, huh?" He clicked his tongue. "You always did have a knack for picking the wrong side." "This isn't about sides, Larkin. This is about stopping a war before it starts." He studied me, his gaze flickering over my face as if searching for a lie. Then he leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. "Darius doesn't want war. He wants dominance, and he'll burn Moonfang to the ground to get it." The blood drained from my face, but I forced myself to stay calm. "When?" Larkin hesitated, glancing around the room. "Soon. He's rallying the others, promising them power, freedom, whatever it takes to get them to follow him. But it's not just the rogues he's after. He's made alliances, dangerous ones." The weight of his words settled like a stone in my chest. "What alliances?" Before he could answer, a voice barked from across the room. "Larkin." We both turned to see one of Darius's lieutenants striding toward us, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. My stomach sank. Larkin stepped back, his expression shuddering. "You should go," he muttered under his breath. "Not without the rest," I hissed. "Later," he snapped, his voice low but urgent. "And bring your shadow with you. He's not as invisible as he thinks." I clenched my fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface, but I nodded and slipped into the shadows. Damon's voice echoed in my earpiece moments later, a mix of relief and irritation. "Evelyn," he said, "what the hell just happened?" I didn't answer immediately, my mind racing with what I'd learned. "Finally," I whispered, "we're running out of time." The air in the rogue stronghold crackled with tension, every breath thick with unspoken threats. Larkin had vanished into the crowd, leaving me stranded in a sea of wolves who had nothing but disdain for me. My pulse thundered in my ears, each second stretching like an eternity. I could feel the weight of Damon's presence somewhere behind me, hidden but close. That fact alone gave me a sliver of confidence. If things went south, I wouldn't be alone. But things were already going south. "Evelyn," a voice snarled behind me. It belonged to a massive wolf with jagged scars slicing across his face, a permanent reminder of rogue brutality. He towered over me, his amber eyes flickering with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" I turned slowly, carefully keeping my expression neutral. "I'm here to talk," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. "Talk?" His lip curled, revealing sharp cannons. "You're a deserter. You don't get to talk." Around us, the murmurs grew louder, the circle of rogues tightening like a noose. My muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I held my ground. "You don't know the whole story," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "I know enough," he growled, stepping closer. "You betrayed us. You think you can just walk back in here and pretend you belong?" The room felt suffocating, the air charged with hostility. I glanced around, searching for a way out, but the rogues were closing in. Panic clawed at my chest, but I swallowed it down. "Let her go." Damon's voice sliced through the tension like a blade. The rogue's head snapped up, his gaze narrowing as Damon stepped into the light. His posture was calm, but there was an edge of menace in his every movement, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "And who the hell are you?" the rogue sneered. Damon didn't answer. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make the rogues pause, uncertainty flickering across their faces. He moved to my side, his arm brushing mine briefly, grounding me. "She's with me," Damon said, his voice low and steady. "And if you have a problem with that, we can settle it right now." The rogue hesitated, his bravado wavering, but then his lips curled into a cruel grin. A pack wolf defending a traitor? That's rich. He lunged without warning, claws slashing through the air. It happened so fast. One moment Damon was standing calmly at my side, and the next he was a blur of motion. His fist connected with the rogue's jaw, the force of the impact sending him sprawling to the ground. Chaos erupted. More rogues surged forward, and Damon pushed me behind him, his body a shield as he met them head-on. "Run, Evelyn," he barked, his voice sharp with urgency. But I didn't run. I couldn't leave him alone against this many. I grabbed a discarded metal rod from the floor, adrenaline surging through my veins. When a rogue lunged at Damon's back, I swung with everything I had, the impact jarring my arms but sending the wolf stumbling away with a snarl. "Evelyn," Damon started, his voice laced with both irritation and surprise. "Don't start," I shot back, positioning myself at his side. "I'm not going anywhere." He gave me a sharp look but didn't argue. We fought together, our movements almost instinctive. Every time a rogue came at me, Damon was there, his claws flashing. And when one slipped past him, I met them with the makeshift weapon, my fear buried beneath a surge of determination. Finally, the remaining rogues scattered, leaving a mess of snarls and growls in their wake. The stronghold fell silent, the tension dissipating like a deflated balloon. I was breathing hard, my arms shaking from exertion, but I felt a flicker of pride. "Well," I panted, "that was fun." Damon turned to me, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a mix of frustration and something else, something warmer, deeper. "You're impossible," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "You're welcome," I said, smirking despite the chaos. Before I could say more, he closed the distance between us, his hands gripping my shoulders. His gaze locked on mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. "I told you to run," he said, his voice rough. "And I told you I'm not going anywhere," I shot back, my voice steady. Something shifted in his expression, the frustration giving way to something softer, something vulnerable. And then he kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It was fierce and consuming, like a storm crashing over me, his hands sliding from my shoulders to my waist, pulling me closer. I melted into him, my fingers tangling in his shirt as the world fell away, leaving only the two of us. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my heart racing. Damon's forehead rested against mine, his eyes searching mine as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "You're infuriating," he murmured. "You're not exactly a walk in the park yourself," I replied, a grin tugging at my lips. His laughter was low, rough, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "We should go," he said after a moment, his tone reluctant. "Probably," I agreed, though neither of us moved. The moment lingered, charged with unspoken promises. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain: we were in this together, and I wasn't going to run. Chapter 6. The sky above Moonfang territory burned with the light of a full moon, its silver glow casting long shadows over the battlefield. The night air was thick with snarls and the clash of claws, every sound amplifying the chaos around me. This was at the moment where everything I had been running from collided with everything I was fighting for. And I wasn't fighting alone. Damon was at my side, a blur of ferocity and precision. His every movement was calculated, his claws slicing through the rogue wolves who dared to breach the pack's borders. He was a storm, unstoppable and relentless, and I found myself mirroring his determination. I wasn't the same woman I had been when I stumbled into this territory. Tonight I was a fighter. A rogue lunged at me from the side, its snarling maw aimed for my throat. I ducked low and swung my blade, a crude but effective weapon I'd salvaged, slashing across its flank. It yelped and retreated, but before it could regroup, Damon leapt in and finished the job. His golden eyes flicked to mine, blazing with intensity. "Keep your guard up, Evelyn." "Thanks for the tip," I shot back, my breath coming in short bursts. "I'll write that one down later." Despite the dire situation, a faint grin tugged at his lips. "You're insufferable." "And yet, here you are," I retorted, spinning to block another attack. Our banter was brief, cut short by the onslaught of rogues. They came in waves, their desperation palpable, their attacks frenzied. But I held my ground, and so did Damon. At one point, a massive wolf barreled into me, knocking me off my feet. Pain radiated through my side, but before I could react, the rogue was on me, its teeth snapping inches from my face. Panic surged, but then Damon was there, yanking the wolf off me with a snarl that sent shivers down my spine. He threw the rogue aside like it weighed nothing, and crouched in front of me, his body a protective barrier. "You okay?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. I nodded, scrambling to my feet. "Yeah, thanks for that. Don't thank me yet," he said, his gaze scanning the battlefield. "It's not over." He was right. The rogues were regrouping, their leader barking orders from the edge of the clearing. I recognized him immediately, Darius. A knot of dread coiled in my stomach. This was the moment I had been dreading, and yet it was the one I knew had to come. Darius was the reason I had betrayed everything I once held dear. The puppet master who had pulled my strings and cast me aside when I was no longer useful. This was my chance to end it. "Damon," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within me. "We have to take out Darius." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "Stay close to me." Together we pushed through the chaos, cutting a path toward the rogue leader. Every step was a battle, every movement a test of our strength and resolve. But we were unstoppable, a force of nature bound by trust and something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. When we reached Darius, he stood waiting, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Evelyn," he drawled, his voice a mockery of familiarity. "I wondered when you'd show up." I stepped forward, my grip tightening on my blade. "This ends tonight, Darius." His laughter was cold and sharp, brave words from a traitor. Damon growled low in his throat, stepping closer to my side. "She's no traitor, and you're about to find out what that means." The fight that followed was brutal, a blur of claws, teeth, and raw power. But as I stood side by side with Damon, something shifted within me. For the first time, I wasn't fighting for survival, I was fighting for a future, for a place where I belonged, and for him. When the dust settled and Darius lay defeated at our feet, I turned to Damon, my chest heaving with exertion. His gaze met mine, and in that moment, the battlefield faded away, leaving only the two of us. "You did it," he said, his voice soft but laced with pride. "We did it," I corrected, a small smile breaking through the exhaustion. His hand found mine, and for a heartbeat, everything felt right. The fight was over, but our story was just beginning. The clash of claws and snarls echoed through Moonfang territory, a symphony of chaos that matched the storm raging inside me. The rogues had come with ferocity, determined to destroy everything in their path. I didn't know if it was fear or instinct driving me, but I wasn't about to let them win. My blade sang as it cut through the air, deflecting an incoming attack. Another rogue lunged toward me, teeth bared, but I ducked low and swung upward, knocking it off balance. The thrill of survival pulsed in my veins, but I couldn't lose focus, not when there was so much at stake. A sudden roar split the battlefield, drawing my attention. My heart froze mid-beat. Caleb was pinned beneath a massive rogue, its fangs mere inches from his throat. He was struggling, his strength waning under the rogue's relentless assault. Without thinking, I ran toward them. "Get off him!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the chaos as I launched myself at the rogue. The force of my impact sent us tumbling. Pain flared in my shoulder as the rogue's claws raked across my skin, but I didn't care. Adrenaline drowned out the sting, leaving only determination. I rolled to my feet just as the rogue lunged again. "Not today," I hissed, dodging its attack and driving my blade into its side. The rogue howled in pain, thrashing wildly before collapsing at my feet. I stood there, chest heaving, as Caleb scrambled to his feet. For a moment he just stared at me, his golden eyes wide with disbelief. "You," he started, but I cut him off. "Don't waste time thanking me. There are still more out there," I said, jerking my head toward the battlefield. Caleb's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. Fair enough. We moved in unison after that, cutting through the chaos like a well-oiled machine. I could feel the tension between us shift, morphing into something lighter, something that felt like trust. When the dust began to settle, and the remaining rogues scattered into the shadows, Caleb turned to face me fully. The fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something softer. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice low but steady. I wiped blood rogue, not mine, off my hands and shrugged. "You're the alpha. If you go down, so does everyone else." It wasn't a hard choice. His expression softened further, and for a moment I thought I saw gratitude flicker in his gaze. "Maybe not for you, but for me it means more than you know." The weight of his words settled over me, but before I could respond, Marcus approached, his expression unreadable. "Caleb," he said, his tone urgent. "The rogues are retreating, but we need to secure the borders." Caleb nodded before turning back to me. "We'll talk later." And then he was gone, leaving me standing there, bloodied and bruised, but strangely lighter. It wasn't until I felt Damon's presence beside me that I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. I glanced at him, and for once, I didn't feel the need to deflect. "Yeah, I think I am," he smirked, his eyes raking over me as if to confirm I wasn't hiding any serious injuries. "You're full of surprises, Evelyn." I arched a brow, unable to resist the playful jab. "What? Did you think I couldn't save the day?" Damon chuckled, the sound warming something inside me. "I think you've got a habit of proving me wrong." "Get used to it," I said, flashing him a grin before turning back to the battlefield. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. And that was worth fighting for. The Moonfang central hall was alive with the soft hum of conversation, pack members lingering in clusters and stealing curious glances my way. I stood near the center of the room, acutely aware of how out of place I looked, clothes-torn, hair in disarray, and the faint scent of battle still clinging to my skin. This was the moment I'd been running from and craving in equal measure. Judgment Day. Only now, it felt more like Redemption Day. Caleb stepped forward, his imposing presence enough to silence the room. His golden eyes swept across the gathered wolves before settling on me. There was no malice in his gaze, no trace of the skepticism that had greeted me when I first crossed their borders. Instead, there was something warmer, something resolute. Tonight, we stand together because of a simple truth, Caleb began, his deep voice commanding attention. We are stronger when we trust each other, when we fight for each other. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Evelyn Carter, he said, his tone steady as his gaze locked on mine, you've proven that the choices we make define us more than the mistakes of our past. You've risked your life for this pack not once, but again and again. For that you have my respect. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words hit harder than I'd expected. Respect. Acceptance. Forgiveness. Things I'd convinced myself I'd never earn again. Today we welcome you as one of our own, Caleb continued, his voice softening. You are Moonfang now, and this is your home. A ripple of murmurs ran through the room, but I barely heard them. My focus was on Caleb and the unwavering sincerity in his gaze. Thank you, I said, my voice trembling slightly as I met his eyes. I won't let you down. He nodded once, a small smile breaking through his usual stoicism. I know you won't. As Caleb stepped back, the hall seemed to exhale all at once. The tension that had lingered for so long melted away, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. But then Damon stepped forward, and my world narrowed to just him. His dark eyes found mine, holding me captive with their intensity. In his hand he held something small and glinting in the firelight. This, he said, his voice low and rough, was my mother's. She gave it to me when I became a warrior, told me it was meant to remind me of what I stand for. I swallowed hard as he held out the pendant, a simple crescent moon etched into polished silver. Now I'm giving it to you, Damon said, his gaze never wavering, because you've shown me what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. And because, his voice softened, a hint of vulnerability slipping through, because you've become my something bigger. The room seemed to fade around us, the murmurs and glances forgotten as I reached out to take the pendant. My fingers brushed his, and a spark of warmth shot up my arm, settling somewhere deep in my chest. Damon, I started, but words failed me. You don't have to say anything, he said, his lips curving into a small, genuine smile. Just promise me you'll wear it. Always. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. With trembling hands, I clasped the pendant around my neck. The room erupted into cheers and howls, but all I could hear was the steady rhythm of my heartbeat and the quiet promise in Damon's eyes. In that moment, surrounded by the pack that had once been my enemy, I knew two things with absolute certainty. I'd found my place, and I'd found my home. The night air was crisp, the stars stretched across the sky like scattered diamonds against velvet. Damon and I stood at the edge of the forest, the quiet hum of the Moonfang estate distant enough to feel like another world. The crescent moon hung low, casting a soft silver glow over everything. We hadn't spoken in minutes, but the silence between us wasn't awkward. It was heavy with everything unspoken, every stolen glance, every touch that lingered longer than it should have. Damon stood close, his hand brushing mine, the warmth of his presence chasing away the night's chill. His scent earthy, comforting, and uniquely as wrapped around me like a second skin. You know, I said, breaking the quiet, my voice softer than I intended. I didn't think I'd make it this far. He turned to me, his dark eyes catching the light in a way that made my breath hitch. What changed? I hesitated, feeling the weight of his gaze. You. A muscle in his jaw tightened, and he reached up, brushing a strand of hair away from my face. The roughness of his fingers sent a shiver down my spine. I never wanted to trust you, Evelyn, he murmured, his voice low, intimate. But damn it, you made it impossible not to. I felt the pull between us, magnetic and undeniable. My heart raced as he stepped closer, his body heat a tangible thing. You make it sound like I did it on purpose, I teased, though my voice betrayed the way he unraveled me. His lips twitched, the ghost of a smile. You're impossible, you know that. You've mentioned. Before I could say more, he tilted my chin up, his fingers warm and firm. My breath caught as he leaned in, the world narrowing until it was just him, his steady heartbeat, the curve of his lips, the fire in his gaze. When his mouth finally met mine, It wasn't tentative. It was everything we'd held back, every fight, every moment of denial, unleashed in one searing kiss. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space between us, just the wild rhythm of our hearts beating in sync. I wrapped my arms around his neck, fingers tangling in his hair, and let myself drown in him. The kiss deepened, his lips coaxing mine apart as his tongue brushed against mine, sending a jolt of heat through me. "Evelyn," he murmured against my lips, his voice a low growl that made my knees weak. "Tell me to stop." I pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, my breathing uneven. "What if I don't want you to?" His eyes darkened, and the raw intensity in them sent a thrill through me. He didn't wait for permission. He scooped me up effortlessly, cradling me against his chest as he carried me toward the soft moss-covered clearing nearby. The world seemed to blur as he laid me down, his body hovering over mine like a shield against everything but him. The cool grass beneath me was a stark contrast to the heat of his touch as his hands roamed, exploring every inch of me with reverence and need. When his lips found my neck, a soft gasp escaped me, my body arching into his. He kissed a trail down to my collarbone, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin, igniting a fire that burned brighter with every touch. I pulled him closer, my nails raking lightly down his back, eliciting a growl that vibrated through me. "You're mine, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice a mixture of promise and possession. "Every part of you." "And you're mine," I whispered back, the words carrying a weight I hadn't fully understood until now. The stars above seemed to shimmer brighter as we moved together, every kiss, every touch, every whispered word a vow neither of us could break. It wasn't just passion, it was something deeper, something that bound us in a way I couldn't put into words. When it was over, we lay tangled together under the open sky, his heart beat a steady rhythm against my cheek. I traced idle patterns on his chest, feeling more at peace than I had in years. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Damon pressed a kiss to my temple, his hand running gently through my hair. "Whatever we want, Evelyn, whatever we want." And for the first time in forever, I believed it. The forest was alive with soft whispers of the wind, the gentle rustling of leaves creating a symphony only the night could orchestrate. I sat on a fallen log, my legs curled beneath me, watching Damon as he stoked the small campfire between us. The warm glow danced across his face, softening the sharp angles of his jaw and making his dark eyes seem impossibly deeper, like they held secrets only I could uncover. "You're staring again," he said, his lips curving into a smug smile without even glancing up. "Maybe I like what I see," I shot back, raising a brow. His gaze flicked to mine, a slow, deliberate sweep that sent a flutter through my chest. "Careful, Evelyn. Compliments like that could make a man think you're warming up to him." I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand. And if I was, Damon's smirk softened, the firelight catching the tender curve of his expression. He crossed the distance between us with effortless grace, crouching down in front of me until we were eye level. "Then I'd say it's about time you admitted it," he murmured, his voice low and teasing. I laughed softly, the sound slipping out before I could stop it. "Arrogant," I said, shaking my head, but the warmth spreading through me betrayed my words. "And you love it," he countered, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch lingered, the pad of his thumb grazing my cheek as his eyes searched mine. "Admit it, Evelyn. You're stuck with me now." The weight of his words settled between us, not heavy, but solid real. I reached up, placing my hand over his, my heart beating in a steady rhythm that matched the certainty blooming in my chest. "I don't think I'd want it any other way," I whispered. The forest was alive with soft whispers of the wind, the gentle rustling of leaves creating a symphony only the night could orchestrate. I sat on a fallen log, my legs curled beneath me, watching Damon as he stoked the small campfire between us. The warm glow danced across his face, softening the sharp angles of his jaw and making his dark eyes seem impossibly deeper, like they held secrets only I could uncover. "You're staring again," he said, his lips curving into a smug smile without even glancing up. "Maybe I like what I see," I shot back, raising a brow. His gaze flicked to mine, a slow, deliberate sweep that sent a flutter through my chest. "Careful, Evelyn. Compliments like that could make a man think you're warming up to him." I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand. And if I was? Damon's smirk softened, the firelight catching the tender curve of his expression. He crossed the distance between us with effortless grace, crouching down in front of me until we were eye level. "Then I'd say it's about time you admitted it," he murmured, his voice low and teasing. I laughed softly, the sound slipping out before I could stop it. "Arrogant," I said, shaking my head, but the warmth spreading through me betrayed my words. "And you love it," he countered, brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch lingered, the pad of his thumb grazing my cheek as his eyes searched mine. "Admit it, Evelyn. You're stuck with me now." The weight of his words settled between us, not heavy, but solid real. I reached up, placing my hand over his, my heart beating in a steady rhythm that matched the certainty blooming in my chest. "I don't think I'd want it any other way," I whispered. Damon grinned, his smile wide and boyish, a glimpse of the man beneath all the stoic gruffness. "You're in trouble now," he teased, leaning closer until his forehead rested against mine. "Trouble's always been my specialty," I shot back, though my voice was softer, filled with more affection than challenge. The moment stretched, and the world around us seemed to fade. The fire crackled, the stars shimmered above, and everything felt right. "Evelyn," Damon said, his voice quiet but firm, "I've spent my whole life trying to be the one everyone could count on. And somehow, you've managed to make me realize I don't always have to carry everything alone. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you in it." My breath caught, the weight of his words hitting me squarely in the squares. "I've spent my whole life running," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "From my past, from my mistakes, from myself. But with you, it feels like I can finally stop." Damon tilted my chin up, his eyes locking with mine. "Good," he said, his voice a gentle command. "Because I'm not letting you go." He kissed me then, slow and deep, the kind of kiss that felt like a promise. It wasn't about passion, it was about connection, about two broken pieces finding a way to fit together. When we finally pulled apart, the fire had burned low, the embers glowing faintly in the darkness. I leaned into him, my head resting against his shoulder as we sat in comfortable silence, the world at peace for just a moment. And then, like all perfect moments, reality nudged its way back in. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the quiet, and we both turned to see Caleb, emerging from the shadows, his expression carefully neutral, but his presence heavy with purpose. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, though his tone carried a hint of dry amusement. Damon sighed, pressing a kiss to my temple before standing. "Depends. Is it good news or bad?" Caleb's gaze flicked between us, his mouth pressing into a thin line. "Let's just say it's complicated. We might have something brewing beyond the borders." My stomach tightened at his words, but Damon's hand found mine, his grip reassuring. "We'll deal with it," Damon said simply, his confidence steady and unshakable. Caleb nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer. "You're part of this now, Evelyn. Don't forget that." As he turned to leave, I looked up at Damon, a wry smile tugging at my lips. "Looks like trouble really is my specialty," he chuckled, pulling me close. "Good thing I'm a sucker for it." The stars above seemed to shine just a little brighter, the future uncertain but no longer something I feared. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I wouldn't be facing it alone. The end.